Hey, Raymond here from the Beginner Photography Podcast. Today, we're talking all about performance and dance photography. So let's get into it.
Welcome to the Beginner Photography Podcast with Raymond Hatfield, the podcast dedicated to helping you grow your photography skills. Raymond interviews the world's top photographers in their field to ask questions that will get you taking better photos today. Now, with you as always, husband, father, home brewer, LA Dodger fan, and Indianapolis wedding photographer, Raymond Hatfield.
Welcome back to today's interview of the Beginner Photography Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Raymond Hatfield, and I'm just happy to be here today. Today is going to be an interview which is very fun and something that I actually have not done before. So you're going to hear me struggle to find the right questions, but I think that that's important for me to tell you right now because that's okay. That's okay. There's so many different types of photography that even as you know, I want you to know that as being a quote-unquote professional photographer, that doesn't mean that I know everything about photography. That's why I started this podcast, so that I could learn more about photography and become a better photographer. There's so many genres that there's just no way to know everything about everything. So this is why I get to ask the professionals the questions to learn. So I'm really excited for today's interview. But first, I want to give a quick shout out to a recent iTunes review, and this review came from Jer. She says, her review starts with, I haven't shot in auto since. She says, I got the notion to search up podcasts while trying to choose from the millions of how-to books on Amazon, and I'm so glad that I did. I spend a lot of time in my car for work, and this podcast has taken me from shooting in auto to refusing to do so. Every podcast has a great tidbit of information that I didn't understand before and fantastic tips. If you're looking to take your camera knowledge and photography skills from what to wow, you have to download this podcast now. Jer, thank you so much for that 5-star iTunes review. It really does mean the world to me, but I want you to know that it wasn't the podcast that did any of that. It is you. You know, you can hear whatever it is that you hear on the podcast, but that won't make you a better photographer. It's you who went out and you put what you learned into action and then you grew from it. So again, Jared, thank you so much for leaving your review. Leaving a review for the podcast, it only takes a minute of your time and it really does help the podcast grow. So today's interview is kind of like I mentioned earlier, is going to be a good one. And it's one of those episodes that even if you don't photograph this type, so dance photography, I think that you're still going to find it incredibly interesting. You know, for me, just hearing how different dance is to shooting a wedding like I'm used to, and also just the amount of attention to detail that has to be paid while shooting is incredible. So as always, I have saved a portion of our interview that focuses on the business side of photography just for premium members who want to actually make money from their cameras. So today, premium members will hear who it is that hires the performance photographer and then who pays them, 2 different people. How to set up an online gallery to sell your photos, and then what products to offer your clients and how to price them. So if you want to learn all of these things and all the business tips from past interview guests, then I want to invite you to become a premium member of the Beginner Photography Podcast. And if you want to do so, you can by just heading over to beginnerphotographypodcast.com and clicking the premium membership button at the top of the page. So that's it. All right, let's go ahead and get on into today's interview right now with Emily Brunner. Emily Brunner is a performance dance photographer from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, who says that she loves dance photography because of the way that it allows us to see the movement, the lines, and the power of dance in a way that we can't with our own eyes. Emily, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Raymond.
I am super excited to talk to you today for a few reasons. One of them being is that over the past few months, we have become closer within a group of photographers where we kind of talk about our goals and getting there. And I've seen you already just in the past few months grow your business. And it's something that I had no ideas about before getting into photography. I haven't interviewed somebody who does dance photography. And just out of happenstance, somebody was asking about dance photography the other day in the Beginner Photography Podcast Facebook group. So there is a need for people like you in the world. So again, I'm really excited to talk to you about you and your journey. But before we get there, can you share with me and the listeners how you got your start in photography in the first place?
So my start in photography really came about from becoming a parent. I wanted photos of my kids to share with my family who lived far away. And I just immediately loved how capturing my life allowed me to see it in a different way and allowed me to share what was going on in my life. I remember being a kid and enjoying photography with my parents' cameras. So maybe I could say I've always been a photographer, but I got really, really into it when I had kids. So maybe about 14 years ago. And I just wanted to learn everything I could about it.
So what was it? Obviously, you wanted to capture stuff to send to your family, but why weren't just the photos on, say, an iPhone good enough for you?
Oh, I wanted them to be beautiful. I would see other photos that I would love, and I thought, I want my photos to look like that. So I guess from the beginning, I could tell the difference between a snapshot and a photo taken with intention. And I knew that I wanted my photos to have that intention behind them. And I also knew that if I was taking photos, I wanted to learn about it. I wanted it to become something that I could enjoy and improve upon so that it could be something that's fulfilling for myself rather than just a snapshot that I didn't think twice about.
Right, of course, of course. So when that time came to get your first camera, did you already have an idea that you wanted a specific DSLR to get into, or was it just let's go down to Costco and buy the first camera that we see?
No, I mean, my husband bought my first DSLR for me as a Christmas gift.
Mm.
So before that, I had a little, like Canon PowerShot digital cameras. Before that, I had a film camera that had interchangeable lenses that my parents had bought for me. But my first real camera in the digital age, my husband picked out for me, and it was a Canon, and I still shoot with Canons today.
Yeah. So getting that camera, when you first got it out of the box, I want to know if you had to judge yourself on a scale from 0 to 10, 0 being you had no knowledge of photography whatsoever. This was your first time ever seeing a camera, and 10 being world class. Where would you say that your skill level was?
I would say my skill level was maybe around a 3 or a 4.
Mm-hmm.
Because I had taken photos, I'd used my parents' film cameras when I was a kid. I never shot in manual. I remember trying once to shoot in manual when I was at Niagara Falls, because I knew that I wanted to get this, the blurred water.
Yeah.
I didn't have a clue how to do it. This was with the film camera when I was in college. And when I got the photos back, they were terrible. I mean, it's blurry, and they were like blue and purple. And so that was my only time that I ever really tried to shoot in manual. Before, there was no internet then, really. So I had no knowledge whatsoever, nowhere to research how to do it. So I would say that when I got that first DSLR out of the box, I knew just a tiny, tiny bit, but really very little. Most of what I knew was more along the lines of composition rather than technical knowledge of how to use the camera.
So how did you go about learning photography? And I'm assuming that you are shooting in manual now. Is that correct?
I do, yeah. Pretty much. I usually shoot in manual unless the lighting situation around me is changing super rapidly and I can't keep up with changing my settings.
You're right, of course. So how did you go about learning manual once you got this new digital camera from your husband?
So when I got the new digital camera from my husband, I actually shot with it for several years, just with the kit lens, not really an automatic. So really focusing on the composition, capturing the moment, my perspective, anything that I could do within my own mind and control with my own hands. That's kind of what I was focusing on. But then I wanted to do more, and I researched and I realized I needed a better lens. So that was like my first step into really getting super serious into photography. I got a new lens.
What lens was that?
It was a Sigma 30 millimeter f1.4. So
okay. You just went all the way.
I did, yeah, and I loved it. It really transformed my photos in a big way.
Yeah,
Um,
coming from the kit lens, I would imagine that it would
yeah,
just be a completely different experience.
yeah, I loved it. It was a great purchase, and even though I rarely use it now because it's for like the crop sensor camera, and now I shoot with a full frame camera. I don't want to sell the lens because it's kind of like meaningful to me. But yeah, so that was my first like real serious like dive into it, and then I knew that I wanted to learn more. When I got that first great lens and I saw the difference, I realized, gosh, if I really learned how to use my camera, I bet I could do even more. And it was at that point that I purchased an online course to dive in and just learn as much as I could about my camera.
hmm So you didn't even go like the book route or YouTube tutorials. It was just, I'm gonna jump head first into an online course.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, I did. It fits my personality. I don't
Yeah,
tend to read much, and there's too much of a rabbit hole with YouTube videos
of
because
course.
I don't know. I needed somebody to like guide me really
Yeah.
specifically, keep me on track. Yeah,
Show you this is exactly what you need to do. That makes sense. That makes sense. I too love online courses for just for that exact reason. They're so hyper focused, and you don't have to go hunting around for
yes,
literally. There's like 24 hours of videos uploaded to YouTube every minute or something. So trying to find the right ones is insane and takes a long time. So,
yes.
can you share what course it was that you signed up for, and how did you like it?
Yeah, so I signed up for Schultz Photo School's Photo Fix class, and I really loved it. I just completely loved it. It was everything I wanted it to be. It told me, it was teaching me all the things that I kind of like knew I wanted to learn, and it did it in a really focused way. It was a great experience doing that.
So at the time, you were still focused on just photographing your children.
Yes.
hmm So, at what point did I want you to tell me a little bit about the dance photography side? At what point did this come along in your life?
Well, my oldest daughter, who's 14 now, she started dancing ballet when she was 4. And so for those first few years, I was just taking kind of like snapshots of her. But she really got into it. Quickly, it became obvious that she loved it, and she started performing more and more. And I wanted beautiful photos of her performing on stage. And I didn't, if I could have hired someone to do it, I would have, to be honest. But I just didn't, there was nobody I could hire to take the photos that I wanted of her. So I said, you know what, I'm going to learn how to do it, and I'm going to do it.
So because that's a big jump from I'm going to photograph my kids to now going into a very like specialized area of photography. So uh, did you go? You photographed your daughter. These photos were beautiful. Did other people see them? Like what gave you the spark to pursue it even further?
Yeah, it was really just sharing my photos. So, and it was a gradual progression. It wasn't like snap overnight. My photos of her performing on stage are beautiful. I had to learn a lot of trial and do a lot of trial and error and learn that way. And she dances so much. I had a lot of opportunities to practice and figure out what I needed to do. But once I got some photos that I was proud of, I shared them on Facebook. The photos of my daughter, I shared them on Facebook, and then the photos that I took of other dancers in the performances. If I knew the parents, I would give them the photos. And then the school, I gave them the photos that I took as well. And really, me giving those photos to the school was what prompted dance photography to become a business for me.
How so? Did they ask for it?
They asked me, yeah, they
Ah.
said, oh, these are wonderful, these are great, we didn't know you were a photographer, would you be willing to photograph our upcoming recital and sell those photos to the parents?
I love it. I love it. So this just kind of fell in your lap. I mean, obviously with lots of practice
Mm-hmm.
and passion for it, it fell into your lap. But so let's talk a little bit about a little bit more about the dance photography itself, because there's really two different types of dance photography. There's the performance, and then there's portraits. So if dance photography is more than just photographing people dancing, can you explain more about what else there is to this?
Well, with dance photography in particular, um, it's really a collaboration between the photographer and the dancer. Even if the dancer is in a performance and doesn't quite realize they're being photographed, it's still kind of a collaboration. That's their art. The photography is our art. And in the same way that we as photographers would kind of be horrified, like imagine, your worst image or a photo you take that's blurry, dark, the white balance is yucky. Imagine if that photo was shared all over the internet by your friends and family, you would be embarrassed. So in that same regard, when we're taking a photograph of a dancer, they want to look their best. They want their technique to look as good as it possibly can. So as photographers, we need to be very, very careful that the photos that we're sharing of them, that we're giving to them or selling to them or sharing with our friends and family, in those pictures, the dancer's technique is good, that their toes are pointed, that their feet are nice and straight, that their legs are straight, that their shoulders aren't all tensed up, that they have a nice expression on their face. All these things that they've worked so hard for and they've trained for, we need to make sure that our photos are showing the dancers to the best of their abilities.
So that's more of the performance side. What about the portrait side? Because first of all, is doing the portrait something that still requires a stage, or does it require a studio? Where do these portraits typically happen?
Yeah, so a dance portrait where it's more like just you and the dancer, and you're taking the time for them to pose, and you're working on their pose and trying to take a beautiful photo. You're creating the photo. That can happen anywhere. Mm-hmm. In my experience, we never do that on the stage. To rent out a stage or find a stage that's available to us to do that is just not really feasible.
Right.
So in my experience, doing dance portraits, we would be doing that either outside, so it's somewhat similar to just any other portrait, finding a place that has nice light and a nice backdrop. And then for a dancer in particular, it also needs to have a nice and safe ground for them to work on and stand on and dance on. Mm-hmm. So outside is an option, on streets, in parks, really just anything that you would do with a normal, regular, just portrait session. Or you can do it in a studio. And by studio, I don't literally mean you need to have like a photography studio, but find a room that's big enough. You need a pretty big space to photograph a dancer. Find a room that's big enough and either bring in your own backdrop or use the walls in the room. And when you're photographing a dancer inside, you're really gonna need to bring in some light. You're gonna need to start using strobes to get enough light to photograph them, just because there's so much less light inside.
Right. I want to talk a little bit more about the posing side, though, because this is something that I feel like so many beginners already have a hard time with enough for just regular people. Right now, we have to deal with somebody who is used to doing something in an exact way. Are you manipulating that at all, or can you kind of walk me through that whole process there, how you get somebody in the pose?
Yeah, so we are manipulating it in a way. With dance photography, we're taking something that's like 4-dimensional. There's time, and then there's the 3 dimensions of space. So we're taking that and we're compressing it into 2 dimensions. So taking time out of it is one thing, but then taking the 3-dimensional pose and transforming it into 2 dimensions makes it a little bit tricky. Mm-hmm. So when we're posing someone, a dancer, I start with the dancer and ask them, like, what are your ideas? What sort of poses do you want to do? All dancers have different abilities. So we want to make sure that whatever we're trying to photograph for them, that it's something that they're good at, something that they feel strong and safe doing. So we never want to push them into doing something that we think is amazing, but might be beyond their comfort ability.
Right.
Yeah, so I always start with them and ask for some inspiration ideas. And they always have ideas. They always know what they want to do. So we start with that, and then I have them do the movement or do the pose for me a few times, and I look at it, and I'm looking at it trying to decide what the best angle is going to be for the camera. So if they're doing an arabesque, that's where their leg like goes back in the air behind them.
Okay.
Straight, their leg is straight. If we do that so their leg is pointing behind them, like away from the camera, I'm not going to see that back leg at all. It's just going to look like they're standing and they have one leg.
Yeah.
And that's not what we want. So if we're photographing an arabesque, we want to see that leg. We want that leg to look nice and long. So we want that leg parallel to the camera. So those are the kind of things that we're thinking about at the beginning of a pose. And then once we have them positioned, we might turn them ever so slightly to get their leg to look as good as it can possibly look. Then we start shooting. And we might tweak it a little bit as we go. When I'm shooting them, I want to have a nice low camera angle that makes them look tall and makes their legs look nice and long. So in that regard, it's a lot different from a portrait of a person. You know, when we're photographing people, we often want their eyes to look nice and big. So we want to be slightly above, eye level. But with dancers, we want to get lower so that we're not distorting their body in an unflattering way. We want their legs to look nice and long.
Yeah, man, that's really interesting. I never really thought about it like that. And it's so obviously before our interview, I was looking at your website, I was looking at your portfolio, and I was looking at your images, and there's kind of this very comfortable feeling as if all the dancers were on stage. And even like for your portraits, that's kind of like why I thought that the camera was so low, because we as an audience would be sitting lower, but that makes so much more sense that it just looks better on camera to accentuate those legs. Okay. Yeah. Little tricks of the trade there. Yeah. I love it. I love it. So what if you were to show up in a situation where, okay, let me rephrase the question. Are the poses that you are asking these dancers to get into, are they just holding like I was going to say a pose, but like a dance move that they are used to, or are you trying to get them to do more? Did that question make sense?
Yes, I think that makes sense. So with classical dance, with ballet, there's really there's really like a lot of sort of standard poses that we would do. With modern contemporary dance, there's going to be a lot more improvisation going on. But in a photo session with a dancer, we're typically working with some sort of a pose, something that's kind of established and that is often in pieces that are going to be choreographed for the dancers. So these are things we're not usually starting with something that's never been done before.
Right.
We're always starting with something that already exists and people are familiar with. And then we might tweak it a little bit. We might rotate the body a little bit, or do something different with the arms or the direction in which they're looking with their head to change it up a little bit. But there's standards with dance, just like there are with music performance. With playing an instrument or photography, there are standards that we need to stick to.
Yeah.
And when the dancers are posing, I'm not really asking them to like hold a pose, because dance is movement. And if they're stationary and trying to hold a pose for a photo, it's going to not look right. It's going to look kind of tense. So I think of the poses that we do as movements. And I ask my dancers, I say, you don't need to hold that for me. I need you, to get into it and then go out of it the same way that you would in a performance or in a class. Okay. And then I'm timing the shot to capture it at the apex of the movement that they're doing.
Wow. How many times do you think you have to have them redo a move before you nail the shot?
Sometimes it's really like sometimes we get it on the first shot. Sometimes we get it after just 2 or 3. Mm-hmm. Other times we work it for 20 minutes.
Wow.
It really just depends on what we're trying to do and the dancer and how quick my reflexes are that day.
So, okay, that was a good amount about posing there. And I think that it might, I think that I was looking at dance photography kind of all wrong, possibly because I am just so uneducated in the field completely, that to me, it looks so much more difficult, right? In terms of the posing, where I said that a lot of beginners have a hard time enough posing regular people. Now we have to pose dancers. But if these dancers already have some sort of base of moves that they already get into, would you say that that is helpful to you as the photographer?
Very, very helpful. Yeah. And especially for me, I am not a dancer, and I was not a dancer. So everything that I've learned about dance, I've learned over the last 14 years from watching my daughter and then taking a dance class myself, which was very humbling, but I wanted to learn more about it. So it is not, with older, more experienced dancers, like knowing how to pose them is not quite as difficult as it seems, but knowing how to recognize in your photo that they're doing the pose correctly, or that maybe they're doing it correctly, but that your camera angle is flattering, and that we have them turned in such a way that it's showing their lines, the literal lines of their legs and their feet and their arms, that it's making all of those look as beautiful as possible. That's the tricky part. And now younger dancers, kids who are maybe like 8, 9, 10 years old, that's going to be a lot harder, honestly, to photograph them, because we're, as photographers, going to need to give them a lot more guidance.
Oh, I see. So that's where being more educated in dance, in the movement, would really help. So
Yeah.
we're talking a lot about lines, and the importance of kind of showing that power and stability, I guess. So how important of a role does focal lengths play in capturing these images? Because a wide angle lens is really going to distort lines. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, yeah. I prefer to use the longest focal length that I can. So somewhere in the range of 70 to 200. I really, if at all possible, I don't want to shoot any wider than 70 millimeters.
Wow.
And this is on my full frame camera. Because you're right, wider angles are going to completely distort their shape. And for a dancer, where their body shape and movement is their art, if we distort that, it's really not flattering to them, and it's not a very honest way to show what they're doing. It doesn't really show what they're doing very well. So when I'm inside, I usually am using 70 millimeters, because that inside, the spaces that I have access to inside are just not big enough to allow me to go all the way to 200 millimeters.
Right.
Now, if I'm shooting a performance, however, where we're in a big auditorium, I am often shooting at 200 millimeters.
Just because you have that extra space.
Yes, yeah.
Sure. So I'd imagine, obviously, being that far back, needing that telephoto lens, do you have any recommendations for anybody just getting into photography who wants to start dance, who maybe the 70 to 200 2.8 is a little bit of a stretch? Do you have any recommendations for what else they could use?
So if we're talking about photography of performances, so inside a theater, you really are going to need the wide open aperture of like a 70 to 200 lens or a 24 to 70 lens to have enough light to capture the movements.
Yeah.
But with dance, there's also a lot of moments where people are not moving, where they are just taking a second in between poses to not even transition, but at the end of a pose, or at the beginning of a movement, at the beginning of a piece that they're starting, at the end of a piece. There are times where people are not moving, or they're not moving very fast. So even if you don't have a super fancy lens, you could use your kit lens, and zoom in all the way to 55 millimeters. Or if you have a kit lens that goes all the way to 300 millimeters, you could use that. You're just going to need to compensate for the more stop down, close down aperture, and increase your ISO to make up for that. So if you're using a kit lens, your shutter speed's going to be a little slower. It's going to be slow enough that if a dancer jumps across the stage, then they'll be a little blurry.
A little blur, sure. So would you say to prioritize a faster aperture, say over longer reach of the focal length?
That's a good question. It depends on what you're doing. If you have a dancer, if one of your kids is dancing and they're doing a lot of performances, I would say in their performing inside, I would say maybe prioritizing aperture might be a good thing. 50 millimeters will be okay. Like if you have like a 24 millimeter lens or even 35, you might end up with a little distortion, but you can scoot further back. If you're not right on top of them taking a picture with the wide angle lens, if you're a little further back, they're in the center of the photo, they're not going to be as distorted. as if
Sure.
you're, right there taking the picture of them.
Yeah.
Now, if you're taking photos of your dancer outside before or after her recital or his recital, for example, and then you don't really need the fast lens quite as much, because if you're outside and you have lots of light, you don't necessarily need that big wide open aperture. So in that case, for a portrait outside of your dancer to celebrate their recital, I would say prioritize the longer focal length. Use a longer focal length and get yourself down low. Don't take the picture from up above, kind of looking down at them so their head's big and their legs are tiny.
Right. That's funny. Yeah, exactly. So obviously you wouldn't be able to do that in a performance setting. But during a performance setting, are you running around from side to side during the actual performance, like while parents are in the audience to capture these photos?
No, no one should ever do that. I go to dress rehearsals. That's my secret.
Mm-hmm.
If a dance school asks me to do a job for them and to photograph the performance, I strongly suggest that I go to their dress rehearsal rather than the performance, because at the dress rehearsal, I can move around. I can try different I can try some photos where I'm close to the stage. I can try some where I'm far back and capturing the whole stage in the lens. I'm not in favor of photographing during performances, both as a photographer, because that's just no fun.
Distracting.
And as a audience member, that's distracting. If you're a parent trying to take photos during the performance, you're missing the performance, taking the photos. And then for the dancers on stage, it can be distracting. It can be very distracting. If they see somebody moving around or walking around, they might think somebody's leaving their performance. One big thing about performance photography, if you are taking a photo during the performance, and even if you're taking the photos during a dress rehearsal, turn your flash off. No flash.
That's why you got to get that faster lens.
Yeah.
It's funny because once we had Charlie, and we started going to these, like little school performances that they put on. They're not dances or anything, but just, like little kindergarten songs that they sing for all the parents. And, you watch all the parents not watch their kids, but just watch their phones they just watch their kids through their phones. You know what I mean? And while I like to, pull out the phone to take one photo just to kind of remember the moment and use it as my 1 second a day, I can imagine that it's as a dance setting, that you would really want these photos of your child being in a situation, doing something that not only are they spending a lot of time working on, but also you don't get time to go see it very often unless it's a performance. So having a photographer run around during the performance would just be very distracting. So I'm glad that you get
people angry.
I would assume so.
And then if you're sitting in a seat trying to take photos from your seat, they're not going to be that great. There's going to be like heads in front of you. You're probably like not at the angle or the perspective that you want. So just go to the dress rehearsal and ask permission. Ask the school, hey, can I go to the dress rehearsal and take some photos then? If the school has an open dress rehearsal where they allow parents to come in, they would so much rather you take photos then than during the performance. And a lot of performances will say at the beginning, please put away all recording devices.
Good.
Yeah, whether it's photos or videos. Dress rehearsals. It's the perfect time to take your photos.
Yeah. More weddings need signs that say, please put away your recording devices. I shared a photo in the Facebook group, in the Beginner Photography Podcast Facebook group, of a guest at a wedding that I was just at, who I couldn't believe it, like just got right in front of the aisle as like the bride was coming down, and you missed the shot. It's like, what do? You always got to prepare for these things and get out of the way. But it was just so blatantly right in the middle of everything, and it was just like the brightest yellow neon dress that you've ever seen in your life. It was atrocious. But I totally went off on a tangent there, so I apologize. I want to go back to your first client. I want to know, how when you decided to start charging for this, when you decided, oh, maybe I could do this, how did they find you? Were you nervous? How did the session turn out? Hey, Raymond here, and if you're listening to this, you are listening to the free version of today's interview. If you want to hear more from today's guest about the business of photography, consider becoming a premium member. Every week, guests answer questions about products, pricing, packages, and so much more that will help your growing photography business thrive. This is the next logical step. To join, head over to beginnerphotographypodcast.com and click the premium membership button at the top of the page.
Yeah, and I think most people who are buying things from you understand that you are not Walmart. You know, I really do, at least in my experience. People understand there's a difference.
Yeah, that's a hard thing, but I'm glad that you shared that. I'm glad that you shared that. Again, that's another huge hurdle for beginners to get over. Whenever I hear any sort of question about pricing, I know that's going to help a lot of people. Can you kind of share, now that you've been shooting dance for a while? I'm sure that you've seen a lot of dance photos. I know personally that you've taken dance photography workshops. What are some signs of an amateur dance photographer?
Okay, so some signs of an amateur dance photographer are having a camera perspective where the camera is high and looking kind of like maybe the camera is at face level, or maybe like chest level, or maybe even higher, especially for the little kids.
Right.
Even like above them. Using a wide angle lens, especially if you're close up taking a photo of somebody. And then probably the really big thing is if the dancer's not doing the pose correctly. You know, if their foot is like sickled, which means it's sort of like turned in like this. If they're doing a jump and their toes are not pointed, but their toes are kind of like straight up or just kind of like halfway pointed. If a knee is bent when it shouldn't be bent. So if the dancer's technique is not correct in the photo, even if it's a beautiful photo with the most beautiful light, you know, and the most gorgeous background ever, it's not a good photo. So I would say those three things are what would tell me that it's an amateur or somebody who hasn't yet studied and learned how to take really great dance photos.
Yeah, what I'm learning is that this form of photography is very, very, very detail oriented and requires a very trained eye from the photographer. And I think it's great to hear that you didn't even start off dancing like as a child, that you got into this much later after just watching your own daughter, which just kind of like goes to show that even if you didn't grow up in dance, you can still pursue something like this and be successful. So
yes,
that's great.
We can always learn. I mean, you know, until our last day, we're always learning. And this is, if you were like me and you didn't learn about dance earlier in your life, you can learn now. I took a dance class. I asked dancers around me. I would show them photos and I would say, what's good about this photo? What's bad about it? Go to workshops, watch YouTube videos of dance classes where you see the instructor teaching the class, observe any dance classes that you have the opportunity to observe. Because when you're observing a class, you hear the teacher correcting the students. So you immediately learn what's proper and what is not. There's a lot of fun ways to learn about it.
I never would have thought about that. I never would have thought about that. Is so smart. I would have just Googled dance photography tips on YouTube, but the fact of just like, well, let's just see what a class entails that's so smart. I'm not a very smart person. This is why I like having these conversations with others, because now I get these other perspectives. That's awesome. What do you think would be something that somebody would be surprised to find out about being a dance photographer?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I mean, something people would be surprised to find out about being a dance photographer. Maybe that you need to have like wardrobe supplies on hand. You need scissors to trim away like loose strings. You need safety pins, because the costuming, like what they're wearing, the wardrobe is also an important part of the photos. So you kind of need to have just some backup supplies. And there's also a lot of retouching that often needs to happen, because with a lot of dance photos, there's a lot of skin showing, arms, legs, faces, and people have bruises on their legs. Maybe they have a line around their ankle from where they were wearing socks earlier in the day, and then,
That's me.
And then they take the sock off before the photo session, and it takes several hours for that like, I don't know what you call it, that line around the ankle to go away.
Yeah.
So if it's still there, you have to edit that out later. So editing dance photos, because of all the skin retouching and the wardrobe, is pretty intense.
That just all goes back to having that strong attention to detail.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. Well, Emily, I want to thank you for your time. You've been very gracious, and you have answered every question that I have thrown your way, and then some. I asked way more questions than I even had written down, and you answered them all wonderfully. I know that the listener is going to get a lot out of this interview with you. So thank you. Before I let you go, can you share with the listeners where they can find some of your work online?
Yeah, so my website is www.emilybrunnerphotography.com, and Brunner is with 2 N's, Brunner. That's my website. And then I also have an Instagram, and it's Emily Brunner Photography, and Facebook page for my business, Emily Brunner Photography. So they all have the same name. So you can find me in any of those places.
That's perfect branding right there.
The local theater taking photos of dancers.
Yeah. Well, again, Emily, I want to thank you so much for coming on. And I always love keeping up with you and your stories. And even on Instagram, I love your little weekly stories that you share on there as well. So I look forward to keeping up with you and everything that you're doing.
Thanks so much, Raymond.
Like I said earlier, it really is amazing how much truly goes into proper dance photography. My biggest takeaway, hands down, was just the amount of collaboration and teamwork required to pull off incredible dance images. Because oftentimes, on a wedding day, when I shoot weddings, I pretty much tell the bride to just leave me alone. I mean, this is her day, I want to capture what her day looked like. I don't want her to pay attention to me, to, take time away from her friends and family, because I'm the stranger at the wedding, But in this setting for Emily in dance photography, it was so great to hear, the other side and truly how much goes into working together just to pull off a great image. So Emily is actually in the Beginner Photography Podcast Facebook group. So feel free to share your biggest takeaway with her, and I'm sure that you would be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have about dance. So if you're not already a part of the Beginner Photography Podcast Facebook group, you can do so by just searching Facebook for Beginner Photography Podcast, and it'll show right up. You got to answer a few questions to be approved into the group. Make sure that you're not trying to sell sunglasses or anything weird like that, and then you're in. So that is it for today's episode. Until next week, I want you to get out, keep shooting, focus on yourself, and be safe. All right. I love you all.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, please leave us a review in iTunes or your favorite podcast player. And continue the conversation with Raymond and other listeners of the podcast by joining the Beginner Photography Podcast Facebook group today. Thank you. We'll see you again next week.